If you are already familiar with the story structure of perfect works, and how Xenogears' Time of the Gospel connects to the events of Xenosaga 3, and the base premise for Episode 6, you can skip to the following time code. As a series, Xeno was conceptualized as a series of 6 interconnected arcs or episodes spanning a time frame of 10.000 years. This is why Xenogears itself ends on the baffling words end of Episode 5, while the concurrent events surrounding Faye are what comprises Episode 5. The entirety of the game's backstory actually also covers the events of Episodes 1 through 4. Thanks to the series' many reboots and rewrites, we have a pretty good idea for the general base premise behind each of the 6 episodes, which are as follows. Episode 1. Mankind discovers the Conduit and abuses its power, which ultimately leads to the destruction of planet Earth. This forces mankind to abandon its cradle and spread out across the galaxy in search of a new home. Episode 2. Interplanetary conflict eventually leads to the creation of the ultimate blo-mechanical weapon system, which uses the Conduit as its power source. This weapon system somehow fuses itself with a higher dimensional entity that becomes trapped within the Conduit. The system eventually crash lands on a desolate planet and seeds it with new life to eventually harvest said life as food. Episode 3 and 4 regards the human civilizations born and nurtured on this planet. Episode 5. The destruction of the autonomous weapon system and freeing of the higher dimensional entity trapped inside the Conduit. While we have a general idea of these first 5 parts, which have been partially retold in some shape or form in all of the different Xeno titles, the contents of Episode 6 have never been disclosed. However, we know that they had planned out at least half of the story of Episode 6 during the time of Xenosaga's development. It is also within Xenosaga's story that we get our biggest clues to the contents of this elusive 6th episode. To preface this, it is worth mentioning that the story of Xenosaga 1 through 3 was originally meant to be covered over the course of just 2 games, and the series was meant to continue into Episodes 3-6, which would have included a reimagining of Xenogears and continue the story beyond it. In its current form, Xenosaga is a spiritual prequel or reimagining of the events leading up to the opening cinematic of Xenogears. Simply put, it was a completely bloated, mismanaged and frankly asinine project. To make it easier to understand, the 6 episodes can be simplified into 3 story arcs. Arc 1, Episode 1+2, The Humans in Space arc. Mankind abandons Earth and fights an intergalactic war. Arc 2, Episode 3+4, The Humans stuck on a different planet arc. Mankind is trapped on an alien planet by an oppressive third party. Arc 3, Episode 5+6, Unknown. While Xenogears is currently slated as Episode 5 within its own continuity, the Xenosaga reimagining of it was meant to be comprised of Episodes 3 and 4. Making the Unknown Episode 6 equivalent to Episodes 5+6 of this revised structure. So the completed vision would look as follows. In this context, it is easier to understand how stories like Xenoblade 1 fit into this original story structure, with close backstory roughly following the outline of Arc 1, the destruction of Earth and exploration of the multiverse, and the events on Bionis following the layout of Arc 2, mankind being enslaved by a higher being. The outline itself is very obviously a space opera inspired by the basic principles of Gnosticism. Humanity falling from grace and becoming trapped within the lower physical plane, but with the added twist of rejecting ascension into the higher plane. This fits with Xenosaga's hints about the contents of Episode 6, which regards the consequence of mankind's rejection of both Gnosis and Zarathustra, rejecting both the false deity that serves as primary antagonist of the second arc and the higher existence. Faye rejected Deus in joining the wave existence. Shulk rejected both Zenza and the godhood offered to him by Elvis. This decision has cataclysmic consequences because it will lead to what Xenogears refers to as the time of the gospel. While it goes completely unexplained in Xenogears, Xenosaga further expands on this time of the gospel. Basically, the Xenosaga universe consists of both a lower physical plane and a higher imaginary plane, which is sort of a collective unconsciousness or a thought plane. These two planes are intrinsically linked and cannot exist without one another, similar to how Zanza and Minath need both a body and soul to exist. The conduit is nothing more than a medium that connects between the two planes, its power coming from the wave existence residing within the imaginary domain. As human wills begin to seek emancipation from this collective will, this dispersion of souls causes a ripple throughout the two planes, which basically causes the collapse of reality. This destruction of the universe is what the series refers to as the time of the gospel. Though the direct details are unknown, Deus' actions were seemingly linked to avoiding this event. Thus episode 6 has to be connected to the time of the gospel, which is the inevitable conclusion of rejecting the Deus Zanza archetype at the end of the second story arc. We can even see this hinted at with the appearance of the inter-dimensional rifts and the Fog King in future connected, which appear 1 year after the death of Zanza. Coincidentally, Xenogears also takes place in year 9999, while the time of the gospel is said to take place in year 10,000. Following the rules of the Xenosaga multiverse, this collapse can be stopped by the higher plane yeeting humanity out of existence, which is the purpose of the anima and animus powers within Chaos and Cosmos. Basically, while the lower plane cannot exist without the higher plane can avoid destruction by cutting off the lower plane from itself. This is the purpose of anima and animus in Xenosaga, and why the power was split between 12 vessels to temporarily halt its effect, granting humanity a couple thousand more years to stop this some other way. Basically, episode 6 is about humans becoming too based for reality to handle them, so the universe itself tries to yeet them out of existence. Since the fail-safes are called anima and animus, the whole thing is obviously allegorical for humans having to control their own ego after becoming enlightened, or else they will become megalomaniacs like the enemy of Act 2. This theme can be seen in characters like Egil who, while opposing Zanza, in their delusion ultimately end up being exactly like him. With all of this in mind, and considering all the unique aspects from each of the 3 different rewrites of this story, I think I came up with a rather logical conclusion to some of the rough contents of episode 6. It all starts making a whole lot more sense if we assume that while Deus, Ion, or Omega are man-made machines, these bodies are actually vessels, or other vessels for a primal aspect of humanity itself. The human counterpart to the wave existence, if you will, an embodiment of humanity's collective consciousness. There are actually several hints that the concepts that make up these machines predate the actual physical existence of the machines themselves. In Xenoblade 2, Ion is built from the Trinity processor's connection to the conduit, which causes the autonomous defense systems of Elysium, the artifices, to be entirely inhuman in design while looking extremely humanoid. However, the most convincing version of this is that its Xenosaga counterpart Omega is built from data of the relics of God that has been gathered from the The being basically the in-game version of the Akashic records, which is the fringe idea that the universe keeps a record of everything that has and ever will occur. In Xenosaga's case, it is a sort of internet that operates by accessing the collective consciousness. Since the conduit also counts among these relics of God, it seems very likely that Omega, which was rebuilt from this same relic data, must thus also have its origin in something primordial. This becomes especially interesting in the thematic correlations between Omega's pilot Dimitri or even Zanza.
Behold this glorious picture. My revenge will begin. My time of victory against his terror has finally come.
You filthy bastard! Stop the emulators now!
Is that you, Rubido? It's been a long time, hasn't it? I must say I've missed you.
Listen, we both know what'll happen if you even think about touching those. Give back Guinan's body and get the hell out of here!
Oh, I am so disappointed in you, Rubido. This circumstance is your fault entirely. There's no one else to blame but yourself, and I'm afraid I've been forced to take matters into my own hands. Since those incomplete units failed their mission 15 years ago.
My fault? Oh yeah? Are you planning on using the emulators in Omega to destroy Udo?
No, it isn't that sort of thing. Nothing can ever destroy Udo. I guess you really don't understand the reasons why I am here.
All right then, fine. Why are you here?
In ancient times, people used to be together with God. People loved God, revered, and even feared God. Out of fear of the undying God, they sought divine power. This was a way for the ancients to resist him. Eventually, they found a method to become gods themselves. We have revived their relics, the Merkaba and the Zohar emulators, as well as Mizrahi's Y data, which holds the records left behind by the ancients. This holds the instructions so that we may become gods once again. You see, Udu is a god of this dimension. If in fact God cannot be destroyed, then we shall be the ones to become gods ourselves. Farewell, my son. I must go now. Remember your great father.
Zanza's role in the story is a symbolic manifestation of the cycle of hatred born from fear, which perpetuates the conflict between Bionus and Mechanus. This sounds very similar to Dmitry Yuriev from Xenosaga, who tried to transcend the wave existence due to the supernatural fear that his contact with it had instilled within him, causing him to create the Omega Metempsychosis, the Xenosaga counterpart to Deus Aeon Zanza, its name meaning Omega Soul Migration, which calls back to Xenogears' opening words, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Omega Metempsychosis serves as an embodiment of mankind's primal fear of the collective consciousness, and Udu. Metempsychosis thus refers to transcending God or conquering this primal fear. It embodies the desire to escape the time of the gospel, as knowledge of this incomprehensible nothingness is what instilled Yuriev with this primal fear to begin with.
It doesn't matter. It has all been a sacred sacrifice, so that I may transcend Udu.
What's the point?
I imagine you heard from Sellers. I am the first human being to make contact with Udu through the transfer experiment. I obtained this power then, but along with it, I was implanted with an inescapable fear. I trembled before that fear. I struggled against it and ran. And eventually, I realized that this fear was in fact what shackles people to the human realm. And to overcome that fear requires the power of a god. I sought divine power, and learned it would be granted if the relics of God were brought together as one. That's why I've come here to Mictum. Now I will transcend the fear of God. I will surpass God's existence. I will obtain Zarathustra that sleeps on Mictum, and ascend to a higher plane, to the realm of God.
This is very similar to Zanza's fear of being forgotten by his own creations. Thus this archetypal figure, embodied by both Zanza and Omega, is an embodiment of a primal part of humanity, a fear of, or its inability to comprehend, complete nothingness.
Zanza and Mayneth were lonely, so they created life in their own image.
And that was how we were born.
As the world advanced to each further stage, it was inherited by generations of different life forms. But over time, awareness of Zanza faded. Zanza feared this. In order to escape his own annihilation, he wished for a world in a perpetual cycle of destruction and recreation.
Bionus being filled with life, and the Telethia coming to wipe it out. It was all the will of Zanza.
It was. But the truth of the matter is that he longed for friendship.
So the big twist of episode 6 likely entails that Deus was not actually simply a machine gone out of control, but rather an embodiment of a primal aspect of humanity. This is hinted at in Shulk's remorse about having to kill Zanza and hope for an alternate route, which is further expanded upon in Future Connected when Shulk says that they shouldn't inherently defy Zanza with their current actions. I believe episode 6 will be about realizing this truth behind Deus and trying to channel its power to stop the dispersion of wills that will lead to the collapse of the multiverse. Xenosaga ends with slowing down this collapse by containing the dispersing wills within a self-contained server sealed away on planet Earth, since Udu is existence itself and should thus be unbeatable, unless they pull some power of friendship nonsense. I think the most likely way to stop the time of the Gospel would be a large-scale version of what has already occurred at the end of Xenosaga, the creation of an independent matrix for humanity. Since the series is not only about rejecting the demiurge but also humanity rejecting godhood, the thematic core of this message would be that humans have to master their own lesser self, and to walk this balancing act beyond good and evil. This would be symbolically realized if by the end of the story humanity used this as a means to create their own virtual reality to stop the collapse of the upper and lower domains. Hence, instead of using the conduit to misuse the power of the upper domain, the story could end in a reversal wherein they instead use the conduit to control Deus, symbolically mastering their lower animal nature and stopping the universal collapse by cutting themselves up from the false light of the wave existence that made them give in to temptation and their own megalomania. Episode 6 could end with humanity using the conduit to create its own virtual reality, thus halting the collapse of the other real domains. Completely recontextualizing the become as gods quote, "Wait a minute, doesn't escaping the destruction of Earth and recreating humanity in a different world sound awfully familiar?" Yep, I think Xenoblade X might actually be inspired by a post-episode 6 type scenario, and there are some very convincing hints to this within the unique structure of Xenoblade X. Heck, maybe the X really does stand for 10. I'm not saying that Xenoblade X literally takes place after episode 6. But I think its structure contains several elements that would have to occur by the end of episode 6. Who knows, maybe it is loosely inspired by remnants of the original draft for Xenosaga that was probably stuffed into a drawer somewhere and collected dust for the next decade. Just saying some of its elements would fit into episode 6. Maybe humanity didn't just escape the destruction of Earth but actually escaped from the lower domain itself. In fact, there are actually some hints towards a deeper truth behind the destruction of Earth. If you pay close attention to it, the explosion actually starts above the planet itself, which may hint at another conduit experiment, which seemed to always occur above orbit. If the events were never about just escaping Earth but the lower domain in its entirety, this would much better explain the necessity for both mimeisms and the lifehold as a means of avoiding the dissolving of the souls within the imaginary domain, until they can be given a new physical host within the enclosed virtual reality of Mira, which appears to exist in some form of pocket dimension. While the Xeno stories usually revolve around humans being integrated into a supercomputer and forced into a new step in evolution, X's story actually reverses this structure, instead starting with transhumanist machines trying to regain their humanity. This would explain the existence of ghosts and teletheia as two different types of gnosis-esque entities, one of which likely originates from the upper domain upon the time of the Gospel, to remove the dispersing human factor from the lower domain. This would be the ghosts that are shown as antagonistic to both humans and ganglion, and another one that is guarding Mira, a remnant of the Deus archetype, in this case Zanza, that is serving, at least in some capacity, as a protector of humanity within this cut-off pocket dimension. The Teletheia is also shown to be antagonistic towards the warped monsters that have come into contact with the Vita and oppose life. Speaking of which, the Great One, the pilot of the Vita, might actually refer to the wave existence Udu or Albus, the archetype of the higher dimensional entity. Seeing as how the wave existence always ends up as the power source of the Deus figure, it wouldn't be too far-fetched if the ganglion considered the Vita a chariot or a vessel of the Great One, especially if the Vita was once powered by the conduit. One last point worth mentioning is that Xenoblade X is the only game where humanity is actively coming together and at the forefront of an intergalactic alliance, while in all the other games human ideals are usually largely opposed to one another, which always leads to the core moral conflict revolving around the conduit and the monado. In other words, humanity as it appears in Xenoblade X is much more mature than in the other titles and fits more into a post-episode 5 type scenario where humans have finally evolved to hold such morals. Lastly, there are the Nopons who, besides L, are the only race native to Mira, considering that Nopon don't appear on the evolutionary chart shown by the architect and that they are the obligatory self-aware meme race of the series. I honestly wouldn't even be surprised if the Nopon end up being some kind of transcendental beings that originate from the higher domain. It would be the ultimate shitpost if the Conduit actually linked to the mythical third titan Noponus, or if the Nopon are some outside observers. There are also some obvious similarities between L and the Overlords from the Childhood's End novel, which has heavily inspired the series. That also ties into this idea of mankind evolving into a higher plane of consciousness, with both L and the Overlords stuck as these half-evolved observers to humanity. But that's enough about that. Anyways, if all of this somehow ends up being true, which it won't, the Blade acronym beyond the logo's artificial destiny emancipator would suddenly make a whole lot more sense. And if this escape into another reality eventually leads into some endless loop where the 6 episodes infinitely repeat one another, Episode 6 ending with the creation of a planet that they eventually blow up in a repeat of Episode 1, thus also explaining how the Conduit came to reside on said planet, and why accessing it will inevitably blow up that planet, it would make a whole lot more sense to just randomly end with the words,